June 7, 1942, Chicago, Illinois. The presses are already running. That morning, the Chicago Tribune's Sunday edition hit doorsteps with a headline that should have ended the war's most important secret before most Americans had even heard of it. Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea. 14 paragraphs in, are buried in a story about the American victory at Midway. A reporter named Stanley Johnston had written something no editor should have let through military censors. A description, in specific detail, of exactly what U.S. naval intelligence had known about the Japanese fleet before the battle even started. If a single Japanese official had read that page and understood what it meant, the United States Navy's greatest intelligence advantage of the entire Pacific War would have ended that Sunday morning. It didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is where this story actually begins. Not with heroism on the front lines, but with a windowless basement 15 levels underground at Pearl Harbor, and the men who built America's biggest secret weapon out of nothing but paper, patience, and stolen fragments of enemy radio traffic. Before we get into how they did it, I want to say something, because this channel only works because of the people watching it. If your family has a connection to this story, a grandfather who served in naval intelligence, the Pacific Fleet, or anywhere in that war, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. These comment sections have turned into some of the best oral history archives on this platform, and I read every single one. Now, back to that basement. By early 1942, a Navy Reserve officer named Commander Joseph Rochefort was running a small, chronically under-resourced unit called Station Hypo out of Pearl Harbor. His team had spent months chipping away at JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational code, and by April 1942 they were reading enough of it to catch fragments of a coming offensive. But the messages kept referencing a target designated only by 2 letters. A.F. Rochefort was convinced it meant Midway Atoll. Washington's competing intelligence office disagreed, guessing the Aleutians instead. So Rochefort ran a test. On his instruction, Midway's garrison sent an uncoded radio message claiming their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Within days, American listening posts intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short on water. The trap had worked, but not because the Japanese Navy was careless. Because nobody in Tokyo had any reason yet to suspect an American cryptanalyst was reading their fleet's internal traffic in something close to real time. Armed with that confirmation, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned 3 American aircraft carriers, including the USS Yorktown, patched together in just 2 days of round-the-clock repair work after Coral Sea, at a rendezvous point northeast of Midway that American sailors nicknamed Point Luck. On June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carrier strike force arrived expecting to ambush a weaker, surprised American fleet. Instead, it sailed directly into a trap built entirely on paperwork. Within roughly 6 minutes on the morning of June 4, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown caught 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their flight decks packed with fueled, armed aircraft in mid-changeover. All 3 were left burning wrecks within minutes of each other. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that critically damaged the Yorktown before it too was found and destroyed later that day. By the time the battle ended on June 7, 1942, Japan had lost all 4 of the carriers that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, along with roughly 3,000 sailors and airmen, and most irreplaceably, hundreds of its most experienced combat pilots and aircrew. It was, without exaggeration, the most decisive naval defeat Japan had suffered in centuries, and the country's own military and civilian population would not learn the true scale of it, not that day, not that year. And in some cases, not until after the war was over, because what the Imperial Japanese Navy's High Command decided to do next, in the hours and weeks after Midway, wasn't to investigate how the Americans had known where and when to strike. It was to make sure almost no one, not the public, not most of its own officer corps, and for a long time, not even the full truth reaching the Emperor himself, ever found out how badly they'd actually lost. June 10, 1942. Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Headquarters. 3 days after the Battle of Midway ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision that would shape the rest of the war more than almost any tactical choice on the water. But it decided the Japanese public would be told they had won. The official announcement described a great victory. American carriers sunk, Japanese losses light. In reality, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, roughly 3,000 men, and the irreplaceable core of its naval aviation. But according to the historical record, only the emperor and a small circle within the cabinet were told the battle had actually been a defeat. And even that account was softened, with the full extent of the losses withheld from Hirohito himself. Survivors, pulled from the wreckage of the sunk carriers, were, according to multiple post-war accounts, effectively quarantined. For ships were routed to ports outside the Japanese home islands, specifically to keep their crews from going ashore and talking. Sailors weren't debriefed and sent home the way the US Navy would have done. They were kept isolated, in some cases for weeks, until the story could be controlled. Understand what that means operationally. For the Imperial Japanese Navy's own leadership was so committed to preserving the illusion of invincibility, both to the public and to itself, that it chose secrecy over an honest investigation into how it had lost 4 carriers in a single morning. And because almost nobody with the authority to ask hard questions was told the full truth, almost nobody asked the one question that actually mattered. How did the Americans know we were coming, know the date, and know almost the entire order of battle? They didn't ask it seriously in June 1942, and 10 months later that same blind spot would cost them their most important admiral, April 18, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain, Imperial Japanese Navy Forward Headquarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, and the officer who had personally planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, was scheduled to fly a 1-day inspection tour to bases near Bougainville to boost morale after months of grinding losses in the Solomon Islands. His staff transmitted his exact itinerary by coded radio message on April 14, down to the minute departure and arrival times, aircraft type, and fighter escort. American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo's successor unit intercepted and decoded that message within hours. Admiral Chester Nimitz personally weighed whether to act on it, reportedly asking his intelligence chief, "Do we try to get him, Farmer?" On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters flew more than 400 miles from Guadalcanal and intercepted Yamamoto's bomber over Bougainville almost exactly on schedule. He was killed in the attack. Japan's most experienced and strategically important naval commander, dead from an ambush that had only been possible because American codebreakers were still reading Japan's naval traffic in near real time. For here is the detail that matters most to this story. American commanders were so afraid this operation would expose the broken code that they built an elaborate cover story before the mission even launched, leaking the idea that Australian coastwatchers hiding in the jungle had simply spotted Yamamoto's plane by chance. US aircraft flew other patrols through the same area, both before and after the strike, specifically to make the ambush look routine rather than targeted. And remarkably, according to the documented historical record, it worked. The Imperial Japanese Navy conducted an investigation into Yamamoto's death. It considered the possibility of a security breach, and it concluded, wrongly, that the timing was most likely coincidence, or at worst the result of coastwatcher reconnaissance, rather than a compromised code. Some communication procedures were tightened in the aftermath, but JN-25, the core fleet code that had betrayed both Midway and Yamamoto's own flight plan, was left fundamentally intact. But that single act of institutional denial, the same instinct that had led the Navy to quarantine its own sailors after Midway, rather than interrogate its own failure, meant the United States would go on reading Japan's naval communications for the rest of the war. The cover-up that began in a Tokyo headquarters building on June 10, 1942, to protect the emperor from bad news, had by 1943 cost Japan its greatest admiral, and its own high command still hadn't found the real reason why. 1951. Tokyo, Japan. 6 years after the war ended, 2 former Imperial Japanese Navy officers sat down to write the book their own government had never allowed to be written during the conflict itself. Fusuo Fuchida had led the first wave of attackers at Pearl Harbor. Masatake Okumiya had served as a Japanese naval aviator through the worst of the Pacific campaign. Together they published Midway, the battle that doomed Japan. For the first time, in their own words, officers who had actually been there began describing what their own high command had refused to examine while the war was still being fought. Fuchida and Okumiya didn't have access to American intelligence records. They didn't yet know the full mechanics of Station Hypo, or Joseph Rochefort's basement office, or the fake water shortage that had confirmed Midway as the target. What they did know, because they had lived through it, was that Japanese commanders had walked into that battle with an arrogance that assumed the Americans couldn't possibly know what was coming. Their book became one of the first honest Japanese acknowledgments that the defeat at Midway wasn't primarily about American courage or luck. It was about information. The Americans had known things they had no reasonable way of knowing, and Japan's own command culture had been too invested in the myth of its own invincibility to ask why. That question, how did they know, wouldn't get a full public answer in Japan for years. It came from the American side first, through congressional investigations into Pearl Harbor in the mid-1940s, through the gradual declassification of Navy cryptanalytic records, FOD, and eventually through the memoirs of the American officers who had actually built the operation. Edwin Layton, who had served as Admiral Nimitz's intelligence chief and had personally briefed him on Yamamoto's flight schedule in 1943, published his own detailed account decades later, laying out for the first time just how deep the Japanese codes had been compromised, and for how long. By the time Japanese historians had the full documentary picture available to compare against their own wartime records, the pattern was impossible to miss. It wasn't that American codebreakers had gotten one lucky break at Midway. It was that Imperial Japanese Navy communications had been readable, in whole or in part, for most of a critical 18-month stretch of the war. And that the institutional instinct at every point where the truth might have surfaced had been to protect appearances instead of investigate the failure. The quarantine of Midway's survivors in June 1942. The falsified victory announcement to the public. The investigation into Yamamoto's death that settled on coastwatchers rather than compromised codes. Each of these wasn't a separate mistake. It was the same mistake, made 3 times, by an institution that had built its entire command culture around the idea that its will and its secrecy were unbreakable. On the American side, the men responsible for that intelligence work spent years receiving almost no public credit at all, partly because the work itself stayed classified for so long, and partly because of Navy politics that had little to do with the Pacific War. Joseph Rochefort, the officer whose Station Hypo team broke JN-25 and set the trap at Midway, was quietly reassigned away from cryptanalysis within months of the battle, caught in an internal rivalry with rival code-breaking offices in Washington. He never received formal recognition for Midway during his lifetime. He died in 1976. It wasn't until 1985 and 1986, more than 4 decades after the battle, and under President Ronald Reagan, that Rochefort was finally, posthumously, awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for what his team had done in that basement at Pearl Harbor. There's a particular irony sitting at the center of this whole story, and it's worth ending on directly. The United States Navy's codebreakers won their greatest intelligence victory of the war not only because they were skilled, though they were, but because the very culture they were up against made it almost impossible for Japan's own high command to admit, even to itself, that its codes might have failed. An institution that quarantines its own sailors to protect a lie isn't equipped to catch the enemy reading its mail. Denial in that specific and costly way did more to protect America's biggest secret in the Pacific than any American security measure ever did. If this is the kind of history you want more of, not the myth, but the paper trail behind it, that's exactly what this channel is built to keep finding. And if anyone in your family had any connection to naval intelligence, code-breaking, or the Pacific Fleet in this era, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it.